Hi everyone. So we'll continue memorizing from the book of Hebrews. Today we are going to memorize Hebrews chapter 5 verse 8. I'll read that first. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. So I'll read 5, 7 and 8 together. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard for his godly fear. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. So this is a very short verse, so I'll give a very short reflection. So here what is given, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. So Jesus is fully man and fully God, right? So he is the perfect man because he didn't have any original sin in him. Also, he never committed any sin. So he is perfect man. He is also God. So he is full of that divine wisdom. So he is not ignorant of anything, right? But there is a knowledge that we acquire through experience, right? For example, Jesus as God, he cannot experience suffering. He cannot experience our weaknesses. He cannot experience our temptation. So all this he chose to experience by assuming humanity, right? So he chose to experience that weakness and he learned how difficult it is to obey because he obeyed in the most difficult circumstance, right? Father asked him to die as a sacrificial lamb on the cross. That was a very tough call, but he learned to obey that through suffering, right? So he learned how difficult it is to obey, how difficult it is to conform our will to the will of Father, right? Very often we learn it in a painstaking way. By going through the suffering, we learn to conform our will to Father's will, right? So that is what is given here, Hebrews 5:8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, right? So he learned that through experience. By experiencing that human weakness, he learned how to obey Father. He learned how difficult it is to obey, right? So that is what is given here. And another point I want to say is, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, right? How much more we should obey our Father, right? That is another point I want to reflect. And another thing is, most often it is through suffering that we conform or we learn to obey, right? It is through suffering we conform our will to our Father's will, right? Otherwise, it's very difficult to conform because we are of a fallen nature, right? So it's very difficult to conform our will to God's will. Very often we learn it through suffering. That is why the saints were not running away from suffering. They rather embrace suffering, right? Saint Paul says, suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope doesn't disappoint us. So through the suffering, we'll be purified. Through the suffering, we'll learn how to obey Father. Through the suffering, we'll learn how to conform our will to our Father's will, right? So it's important that we go through suffering. So when suffering comes to us, we should also try to embrace that, even though it's difficult, right? That is what all the saints do. And that's a model that Jesus has taught us also. With that, I'll conclude today's meditation. I'll read Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 again. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Thank you. God bless you all.